Thanks. It's a good sign that you're all here. That means we still care. We still really are inspired by these fish, and we are interested in their future. And so I've been studying salmon streams for about almost 23 years now, based out of Homer, and have really focused my time on how our temperatures in these rivers are changing. And I imagine the topic will come up in some of the questions, but I think Peter, you left us with, you started off with all the happy stuff and ended on the hard stuff, and it's hard not to end there. But I think for me, the way I continue to stay committed to this work is that I do believe that us having Chinook salmon into the future is a choice that Alaskans are going to need to make. It's not going to happen unless we decide we want it to happen. And it's going to require a lot of compromise and collaboration to end up with salmon into the future, particularly king salmon. But that if we don't make an active choice, it will slip through our fingers. So I'm excited to continue the conversation through your questions.
Hi, so my name is Adam Reimer, and I work for the Department of Fish and Game. My role is as a researcher in the Division of Sport Fisheries is mainly through escapement goals. So I participate in the setting and deciding of escapement goals. And I guess, first of all, you should maybe serve tissues with your talk.
I agree.
It wasn't easy to sit through.
Yep.
But on the topic, I didn't write down your three. What were your two?
Take on
state. There's many states.
There's many states, and then it depends on what you measure, how you measure.
Yeah, those were both good. The thing that I keep coming back to, and I was thinking about today, is I don't know if this is a tag on to those or not, but the one thing I wanted to emphasize is escapement goals are set to manage for yield. So that means harvest, the fish that people take home. And so that's a conservative measure compared to conservation. And I guess I wanted to focus on that, or I wanted to make that as a point, because it's like, you sit through Peter's talk, it's like, what are we going to do about this? And I guess I would suggest that the framework of what we are going to do about it is there. We have this escapement goal process, we have stock of concern process, we have, as Peter said, great habitat, and we have a permitting process. And then we have researchers working on things like temperature that aren't kind of in our existing baseline. And so I guess that was the corollary I wanted to add to what Peter had to say. It's just that we do have a framework that allows for public participation and is set up in a way that conservation should be a default with while managing for sustained yield.
So I'm going to start with a question, because 6 years ago, Trout Unlimited, we hosted a panel discussion. It was when the governor started the Chinook initiative, and we had a panel discussion, and their Nushagak was one of the few bright spots. A couple other places. Are there any bright spots for Chinook anywhere? No. It was an easy one. Okay. So,
there's really not. That's the Chinook in particular, right? It's clear. Anyone, anyone who says, gosh, there's no salmon left in the ocean, well, that's crazy talk. There's more salmon in the ocean than there's been in a long time. But Chinook across the board, North Pacific to Alaska, functionally gone in Kamchatka. Chinook are really struggling.
So Alexa has a mic if folks have questions. Or if you got a loud voice, you can just.
No, I think you have a mic. My name is Richard Peck. I've been here on the Kenai off and on since 1969, and believe me, I have seen some dramatic changes. One of the things I want to mention, and I'm not going to criticize the doctor, but he needs to graph the industrialization of pollock along with the grub and the salmon, and how that they're equal. I spent 8 years at Dutch Harbor, and believe me, there's a lot of bycatch. I swear it's not all being recorded. And I think that we need to get a handle on that. Climate change is making an issue. There's good points. But the industrialization, and I mean industrialization of the northern Pacific and the rest of it needs to be taken care of in consideration. And we need to put limits on the bycatch that's happening to our fish, along with limits on first fishing here and forefishing. Until all three segments are properly regulated, I don't think you're ever going to see the Chinook coming back with a chum. No, sir.
You guys have, bycatch has been huge in the news.
Well, I was surprised it was only the second question.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't the first. It's bycatch, incidental harvest. I would chalk it up. I am not ignoring it. I chalk it up as the ocean has changed, and whether it is marine mammals, pollock industry, other fisheries that are intentionally catching fish going to different areas, the ocean is more dangerous than it used to be. So if you're programmed to spend a lot of time in the ocean to get big, that's probably not a great strategy anymore. I'm also going to say this, because I have looked hard at the numbers from the industry that has very strong monitoring, that the numbers do not explain the stark decline. Not in and of itself. Is it doing anyone any favors? Is it helping the fish? No, but it's not the sole driver. So I'd say that. In general, when pollock started really going up was when the North Pacific flipped from being actually quite cold to actually quite warm, and salmon in general started doing well again. So it's a complicated system, and I'm not trying to detract from the question that it's an important part of the system, but I do think it is just one part of a really complex system that's changing maybe even ever quickly.
So are there any genetic studies being done on like the bycatch from pollock fishery? I was wondering, I was reading that like the Yukon fish are not being caught that much that's not part of the bycatch, is what I read. I don't know if that's true.
You want it?
Study.
You want it?
I don't know about
This more.
So we definitely have a genetics lab, and they'll be directed at all kinds of bycatch issues. I'm not aware of a pollock fishery specific. I couldn't speak to that literature. Maybe Peter can.
Yeah. It's from the monitoring. It's called the GSI. So. Genetic stock identification is done, where you can assign fish to fairly large areas, but be like Western Alaska as a stock. It's monitored pretty consistently from the pollock industry, and that's where the numbers don't totally jive, in the sense the total number that are caught, and then you start parsing the different ages and how many are local Alaska fish versus Washington, Oregon, British Columbia fish, which is a whole nother issue. That there are fish that are being caught from those areas that are outright listed under the Endangered Species Act. So we'll set that aside for a moment. That when you do the parsing and you take into account the fact that if you catch a fish in its second year in the ocean, that fish would not necessarily have survived if it was going to mature, say, at age 3 or 4, it may not have survived. So there's some accounting that has to get done, and it starts looking a little bit like hoodoo voodoo. But when you do the best accounting you can, the numbers just don't explain the dramatic decline in abundance. But it should not be taken as it doesn't matter. And the part that I think has to be said is, even if you can't explain the decline in Yukon Chinook, some Yukon Chinook are being caught every year. And it's a fact that some fish are being caught every year by the pollock industry when the local people get none. And that is fundamentally unfair. And that is true.
We're gonna have to hold this mic extra close for it to work.
Just kind of follow up. We explain a little bit more, like why is it the king salmon or so the Chinook salmon are so much more effective than the others? I know they spend more time out in the ocean. Is that it, or is there more to it than that?
That's a decent. I wanted to add on the like, are there any bright spots for kings? On the Fish and Game website that Dr. Westley mentioned, a researcher at Fish and Game named Andrew Monroe writes a report where he tells you how we do relative to escapement goals for all the stocks we monitor, and it is if you go into the appendices, it'll be listed by area of the state and then species, and we'll tell you, we made this percentage of the goals in this for this species in this area, and it is kings are the one where we're frequently below the goal. So that is a way kind of to the point of, can you research that yourself? That's an area where you can research it yourself. As far as why kings are worse, I think that the long life history is a good place to start. So if you're spending, the more the presentation focused on the ocean being a risky place, the more time you're out there, those risks compound. And then on this concept of could bycatch, explain it. That was when I was listening to the presentation. Those were, I was taking notes, and I think that Dr. Westley did a good job of talking about this, but there is a bias to blame the things we can measure, and so the pollock thing is something like that, and then I would even suggest like the things that are brought up, like hatcheries. Okay, well we know that's a thing we know, and so there's this tendency to want to point to that.
There's also things we can do about it. Those are things that we know, but also levers we conceivably could pull.
They're actionable, so I'm not criticizing the focus on that, but it's a marine ecosystem, and so there are factors out there that we can measure and that we can change, and then there's factors that we can't measure and maybe can't change, and things we just don't understand. And so I guess it's just a second to this point of, it's going to be difficult to put your finger on, one. I don't think we're in the phase where we can say if we fix this, our problems will be solved. Yeah. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, because I think that's, salmon are a fabulous creature with an incredibly complex life history from freshwater to saltwater and back. And so the idea that there will be a smoking gun, a silver bullet, it's not going to exist. There may be certain years where one is having more influence than another, but it is a suite of we could probably come up with 10 solid reasons why Chinook are not doing well. And that is just like when we get a little sick, right? If you're super stressed suddenly at work, and then you get tired, and then all of these things add on to each other. And so that's where I think it is really important to pull back and look at our system of understanding the health of these populations. And so, although Adam, you seem to feel like we have it all the infrastructure is in place for us to successfully manage for high yield of salmon, of king salmon, I'm not convinced that's true. I think that there are, it's a very highly politicized process from the Board of Fish, from who's leading the department to their priorities that they place on their dwindling workforce of just not having enough biologists and managers to do the work that needs to be done to keep these populations that are so critical for our state. We just really haven't invested as a state in the department to create the robust models to be able to actually incorporate climate into those models, that we're not relying on simply what are escapement models that are built on past understandings of how these systems work, that we can assume those will help us in an ever-changing future. It's global wobbling these days. This is a cold spring, and that's got to have a lot of repercussions for what June looks like in our rivers, and that will have a lot of implications for years in the future in terms of returns. So it's a really complex system, and if we begin to point at individual factors, I think we're really missing the point. It is going to be a much more complex solution to a very complex problem. And if we do start to, okay, let's blame these folks, or let's blame hatcheries, or let's just blame politics, we're gonna lose. And so it has to be a much more holistic process towards solutions than I think we have developed in the past.
I want to add something that is way less inspiring and intellectual than what you just shared. I want to go back to also the way I think about why Chinook too is like, it's one of the 10 things that you can lay down. But when you look across different species of Chinook, that compared to the really abundant other species, pink chum and sockeye, they tend to be much more coastal. They're much closer to shore. And so if you start thinking about predation and other things, they live in a different type of environment. The idea is that if you make it into the middle of the North Pacific or Gulf of Alaska, there's not a whole lot out there, that most of the mouths trying to eat you are closer to shore. It's one of the 10 things or whatever the list, but when I think about why Chinook, that's part of where my mind goes. And I still agree with everything Sue said.
I've got a question about some of the, perhaps some of the data that you put up on the screen, but also some years back, Dr. Ed Berg would talk about a series of cycles that are 18 to 20 years in length, and they relate to wobbles of the Earth. In the past year, there's been some research that's shown that in some of the southern oceans, they have pointed to the blanching of corals and so on as actually being related to those 18-year cycles or 20-year cycles. I'm wondering do you think that could be playing a role here? Again, looking at your data, I just happened to look at it and think about that and realize that every time you showed this decline, using today was the end date, if you go back 20 years, there was another decline. And so I wonder if you think that may be playing a role.
So one of the really big ideas that has transformed the way we understand salmon productivity and survival was these periodic, really large-scale shifts in the marine environment that are tied to things like atmospheric pressure, sea surface temperature, and that they've got various names. You can quantify them in different ways. They go by names like Pacific Decadal Oscillation and the North Pacific Gulf Oscillation. I mean, there's all kinds of names. So here's the thing. They tend to explain the ups and downs for a period of time, and then it breaks apart. So we really understood there was a super strong association with essentially deviations of the sea surface temperature, such that when it was generally warm in Alaska, if the North Pacific was generally warm, Alaska salmon did great, and California, Oregon, they did terrible, and it was out of sync. They oscillated out of sync, and that's totally broken apart. And now there's another one that sort of explains more of the variation, and that might be breaking apart. So it seems like we have these short-term statistical associations that can have some predictive power for a period of time, but we don't understand the mechanisms. of why we have that association. And the fact that they break apart doesn't give you warm, fuzzy feelings that it's going to be super useful long term. But for short periods of time, it can have some power to predict what might be coming. But if really the question is, do I think that we're just sort of in a down cycle, the bright side is coming next year or some year down the road? I don't think so. Man, it is depressing. Sorry, I'm not trying to be depressing.
You're not doing it.
No, Jesus.
I'm not trying.
I know. Take 3 Prozacs and call me in the morning, yeah.
I do think maybe a different interpretation of what you said. I don't pretend to know the answer to if this is the beginning of a gradual decline or a trial, but I do think it's important to say that relative to, say, like some kind of evolutionary time scale, our data sets are short. They're very short, and so we're trying to make. I mean, we've already talked about how this is a multivariate system, and there are things we know about, things we don't know about, correlations we think we understand, we don't. I also agree the history of trying to find environmental correlates with in a stock recruit relationship is fraught with it works, and then 5 years later it's like, oh, it doesn't work. And so that's kind of the theme. And to me, that's not hard to conceptualize because you've got many possible limiting factors, and so there's no reason that the limiting factor 5 years ago has to be the same one now. And there's also no reason that the limiting factor on the Kenai has to be the same one in the Yukon, and that's what complicates these things. But I don't know if that's what you're asking, but I think maybe a tag on to your question was that we are data limited compared to the inference that we would like to make. Very interesting. I saw all kinds of hands.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I got a question for everybody. Is there a publicly elected official here tonight? Is anyone in this room caught and ate a salmon?
Today or no?
And this would be hard for you to answer, but it seems like in the picture of all of us discussing this, us is so much involved with this, and how we manage what we discover through science and so forth in the political process. I know it's not an easy answer to give me, but it seems like this is a beautiful thing, what we're discovering. And it's brought to light, and people come to see it. This is important that we know this. But maybe it's more of a comment than a question. I think that the best thing that could happen from this kind of thing is for us to get more politically involved in some ways, to each individually understand what to back off from and what to compromise. It's not easily done, but this is going to. Doesn't it seem like it can spiral out of control as we watch it, if we don't somehow become connected, publicly, and politically. There should be a representative here of our government. I hope there is at this next presentation. I'm sorry, that wasn't really a question, but, have you, amongst your peers, no doubt thought about this, have you thought about some different ways that we might crack the nut on public, this is a public awareness event for sure, but it seems like all the ballot measures we've gone through over all the years with the Salmon Fest thing and so forth, we've had some success, like with the Pebble Mine and other habitat issues, but it seems like we're so concerned with the money. I'm sorry, I'm kind of getting off on a comment, but if we can turn some of the focus also on us and how we might, politically, make some changes. So,
Go for it.
maybe you have something to say about that.
Yeah, I'm gonna dig for a question in there, and I guess I would try to go back to what I said. It sounds like maybe it wasn't well received, but is our process for managing salmon populations perfect? No, it is not perfect. We would probably all agree with that. but there is opportunity for public comment. And I think that was the point I was trying to make before. And so I guess I thank you for allowing me a second chance to try to make it. But, you know, there's AC meetings, there's Board of Fisheries meetings, you can write in, you can show up. And so I guess I wasn't so much trying to defend it as a perfect it's a sausage factory, right? The process is messy, the result hopefully good. But I think really what I was trying to emphasize is that hopefully if what I got out of yours is like, if you don't like the lay of the land with respect to fisheries management, the good news is that there is a public process and you are capable of participating in that. And that was kind of the point I was trying to make about the scaffolding or the infrastructure being there.
So maybe I'll riff off that a little bit, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the board process and the board is really regulations and allocative, right? I mean, when it comes down to sort of allocative, so I'm thinking about where people have the ability to really be engaged. And some of the things that we're talking about, like escapement, that kind of stuff, are really kind of more purviews, I think, of the department. So, and this is an open question, I'm curious about this too. Is there a way, do you have recommendations if people want to weigh in on escapement decisions? I mean, the fact is, you know, they are ranges. And the state has beautiful language about sustained yield and other things. But if we have a range and people are saying, you know what, I understand the science, I would rather be conservative and have higher escapement goals. I'm worried about fish being smaller, fewer eggs. I want to be more escaped than less. I understand it might forego some of my harvest. Can they weigh in on that? Because that seems to be more purview of the department versus they can say it at the board. But I'm just wondering what power people have on some of those really critical decisions that seem to be kind of locked into the department.
Well, the mechanism is called an optimum escapement goal. So the department has authority to set SEGs, which are goals that we believe are consistent with maximizing sustained yield. Again, yield. This was maybe another thing. I don't know. I took all kinds of stuff out of your question or comment or whatever it was. I liked a lot of it, but you know, yield. That's a human use. You know, so that's what we're mandated to manage for is yield. But there is another goal called the optimum escapement goal, and the optimum escapement goal is the board's, which I'm sure you know, but is the board's purview. And so there is a wiggle room between what the department recommends and what the board ultimately adopts, and that gap or the differences are decided by the people who participate in the process. And so I'm just trying to think about, you know, you can sit through a presentation like that, and then, but you know what's actionable, and I'm just trying to suggest that participating in the public process is actionable. Okay, go ahead.
I like the actionable part. I think so we're here at a Trout Unlimited event, so I'm going to make a crazy assumption that most of you have spent time enjoying our rivers, around in boats, that you have an affinity for the personal harvesting of salmon. And so you are all involved in the salmon system as a end user, as a potential educator of the person next to you on the bank who's being really disrespectful of the vegetation, or, you know, like there's a lot of ways that you all can be ambassadors of like good behavior in our salmon system. I think that my experience, very little experience, lots of conversations about Board of Fish, that is a hard space to move into, and that it is a very intimidating space. And if you walk up with your piece of paper and are not identified as part of one of the strong groups in the room, it's a very quiet voice that's heard. And so I do think that it is a intimidating space to encourage people to just like get involved with Board of Fish. But as a group, and maybe this is Trout Unlimited or some Kenai Peninsula Fishers, that you as a collective have a voice because you have a set of values and a set of outcomes that you are willing to stand up for, which is we want Chinook into the future and we want to support efforts that get us there. That's the crux, is like what are the steps that get us there, and I think that's where there has to be some real accountability. Like we really do have to look into these 10 things, figure out which ones are actionable. Can we do something about changing hatchery dynamics? Can we do something about changing how much influence we have in carbon emissions? Can we make sure that we are a little more committed to streamside vegetation and keeping the rivers as healthy? We claim that they're really healthy, but I think all of us could point to places where we know some restoration is needed. There's active restoration that the chapter is doing on Resurrection Creek. So we all have a role in the salmon system, and I would encourage you to figure out where you think you have your greatest power and then bring 10 of your friends along with you. Because I do think that there's a lot we can do, but I will remain skeptical that our existing systems are well designed for the public to be deeply engaged.
So I got a question along those lines. Is there enough money for research? I mean, it sounds like there's so much we don't know. Like I was talking about genetics of what's being caught, but it's bycatch for one thing. Or we don't even know, like they're starting a coho study on the Kenai this year. There's big lapses in that. So is that something people could push for more money for that too, right? Correct? Is that there's big gaps in what we know? Correct. I mean,
The university guy wants to answer.
You should say the obvious, though, if you're
more
going to.
money for the university for fishing game. Both.
More. The questions before us are difficult questions. More money for research would always benefit those questions, and those dollars. Fish and Game could use those dollars. The university could use those dollars. Private nonprofits could use those dollars. To me, I'm not. It's a need. Yeah. Can you do better than that?
Well, at the risk of putting myself out of business, I mean, the reality is we're never. There's always going to be unknowns, right? And there's always going to be questions. That's the beautiful part of science. You do some work, and it gives you 10 more questions. And so there's always the fallacy of thinking, if only I did one more project, if I had this year's data set, then I will be able to do something. I think the important question to ask is, are there things that we truly don't know now that are impeding our ability to make the right choices? Or is it we actually know what we kind of need to do and we're choosing not to do it? And I would argue that's often the case. But more money for research and more graduate students is great, but we should be realistic about the true utility of the projects.
I'd just like to make a plug for if you're going to be able to be at the Fish Habitat Partnership the next 2 days, that tomorrow there's a conversation about sort of science to policy, like how you get from a bunch of research papers and grad students to actually influencing policy. And it sounds good, but it's actually incredibly difficult. And it's, again, part of our human structures that are getting in the way. But just because you've got a bunch of answers in your paper does not mean that they're being read by or implemented by or respected by those who are making decisions. So it is, so money's part of it, but not that many problems get truly solved by just more and more money. So I think it, there's a little more introspection required.
I mean, and if you wanted the flip side of it, you could say, well, how many research dollars are spent on studying salmon in the Columbia River, and how well are they doing? Right, they're studied to death, and there's more biologists than fish in most runs, and so we really know often what we need to do, and focusing on the true gaps. Sometimes there are real gaps, right? And we can't make a decision without this information. But at worst, uncertainty can be used as a way to stall and to maintain status quo. That's a time-honored tradition. Need we talk about tobacco industry or others, so that you can sow doubt because of uncertainty and meaning that we don't do anything. But there are definitely times if we were going to be proactive, truly conservation-minded and proactive, we can make decisions often with the information we have.
Questions?
I got so many questions, you probably can't shut me up. So I'm going to try to limit it to just 2 or 3. The first one that comes to mind is the decreasing size in salmon. And
The answer is pike. Pike are doing it.
right, yeah,
Sorry.
for sure.
Yeah, okay.
But I was having an interesting discussion with a guy that knows a lot more about me, and he is convinced it is related to dissolved oxygen levels in the
Yeah.
ocean, which is again tied to temperature. I was just curious thoughts on that. Or are there
The Gort hypothesis. Yes, familiar. So there's a physiological ecology that there are relationships between body size, oxygen, that there may be something to it. The analyses, we ask those questions like, do you see, if that's the case, as things warm up, is temperature in the ocean an explanatory variable consistent with that hypothesis? And it's not. So the evidence doesn't really bore it out. There's parts of that hypothesis that don't make a whole lot of sense to me, that there are large-bodied fishes in places like parts of the Amazon that are really low oxygen. The caveat being some of them actually can gulp air, but that's a side note. But it's a bit of a controversial hypothesis. I don't think it is, again, the one smoking gun that's driving all of this.
Can I ask one more?
Sure.
So, if you kind of look at what's going on holistically in the ocean, it's not just salmon. I mean, it's natural for wildlife populations to go up and down. But
Mhm.
I think we're seeing everything from Ketchimak king crab to eastside razor clams to mers in the Bering Sea to kings. It's kind of a lot of things together happening at once, and it seems kind of tied to trophic interactions. But then we got Bristol Bay that's doing really well. And kind of curious your thoughts on why is it doing well, and do you think it'll sustain?
You want it? Bristol Bay. Here's a bright spot. Everyone talks about it's getting too warm, and the reality is it looks like Bristol Bay is in the Goldilocks zone. It is in this super sweet spot where it has warmed up in Bristol Bay. Sockeye are tied to rearing in lakes. Those lakes have warmed up such that fish that generally are going to sea after 1 year in the freshwater have longer to grow. They're getting bigger, and that, generally speaking, all else being equal, a larger fish going to the ocean tends to survive better. So right now, the warming in Bristol Bay is beneficial. It's a sort of a net positive. It's in a real, for sockeye. But not for kings. Yeah, exactly. And they're going into, that's the thing, they're going into the same ocean, right? They're going in the same ocean at about the same time. They tend to eat the same things when they're little, right? There's a lot of commonalities, head scratchers. For sockeye, 70-some million fish last year, but that's kind of a bright spot for that species, that warming is beneficial. The question is, as it continues to warm, things don't continue to go up in a straight line in terms of responses. At some point, you're going to meet some thresholds. So it's going to come down from the atmosphere at some point here, but.
Thank you, I'll shut up now.
Oxygen.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Nushagak, previously we've always had like 100,000 fish escapement before we start fishing. This year they're talking about 800,000 fish escaping before we start fishing, or June 28th.
800,000 sockeye escaping.
My question is, how is that going to affect competition for like the nesting grounds between kings and reds? Does that make sense?
I don't know if I understand, but usually, as far as spawning areas, we think that they're distinct for those two species. So I'm not. Did I miss the question or not?
No, maybe not.
Yeah.
I just don't understand what the logic is between going from 100,000 before we start fishing to 800,000. Like, what's that gonna change?
Oh. And we're talking about 800,000 sockeye have to escape, right? Yeah. They're trying to take their foot off the neck of Chinook, right? So rather than going after 100,000, you have to wait to open and start fishing for 800,000, so there will not be fishing that will be incidentally catching Chinook. So it's not like, oh, we want the extra sockeye. It is a target switch point to try to allow as many Chinook to enter as possible. It comes back to that conundrum a messy conundrum of how do you catch as many. There's essentially extra sockeye that are not going to be caught because we're trying to not catch too many Chinook. So if that makes sense, it's an approach to avoid catching Chinook by letting in more sockeye.
And those trade-offs.
Yeah.
And those kind of trade-offs are common. And I thought we'd talk about them, the ones we make around here more, to be honest. But
we can.
Yeah. I don't know. It wasn't a suggestion. Failed prediction. But yeah, those kind of trade-offs are, would you call it a messy
manager's dilemma?
A manager's dilemma. That's what they spend their days trying to figure out. And there isn't a perfect solution because the species are commingled and
yeah.
Hi everybody. Really appreciate the focus on public process and getting more engaged. I think there's possibly a need for more discussion on the federal process, and I think as Alaskans we have a lot more impact on that than we think we do, and the state of Alaska's, the governor's office has a lot more impact on that than I think most people realize. But the question for you three, and maybe limit it to your most favorite idea, but I think both processes, state and federal, could benefit from a more nimble, adaptive management process. And I'm curious kind of which elements of adaptive management you each would like to see integrated into the management process.
I don't know if I have a great, we spoke earlier about how the board of, I'm not super knowledgeable about the federal process, but the state process, we spoke earlier about how it can be co-opted by the loudest voice in the room, so to speak. And so then the nimbleness, I guess, maybe I'll just take a pass on that in saying that I would characterize the situation the other way, where there's a human tendency to maybe think we know more than we do, and so to kind of over-interpret the data we have available to us. And so if I see, I want to say if I see plenty of flaws, but I would say there might be a slight bias towards that, towards acting on too little, or the acting on a relationship before you know it's the right one. I'm sure these guys are going to disagree, so let's let them talk.
Well, I'm going to stick in the world that I know, which is understanding how freshwater conditions impact salmon, and that, our whole fishery is, we count fish, right? Like that's the escapement is just counting fish. And from my experience in certain systems up in the Susitna and such, having information about the river condition that the fish are returning into, I don't think is appreciated enough, or and maybe as we have years like 2019, which was like, there was no water in the river, and what water it was really warm. But I'm a big fan of having more investment in technology that allows a fisheries manager to understand what the water levels, what the water temperatures of that system that these fish are coming back into are facing, and that they can make decisions based on, like, oh, we've done a week of over 20 degrees Celsius water. I'm gonna put things on pause because these fish are just pooling down low in the river, getting slaughtered by all the fishermen because they don't want to go upstream, and we need to take a pause because the river conditions are really bad. And so I would like to see greater investment in better tools for the managers, that they can make informed decisions in real time, not like their report at the end of the season, like, well, yeah, apparently we should have slowed down a little bit in July there. But so that's what my brain goes to.
And I'm going to gleam onto the adaptive management part of what you said. So there's been a lot of talk of adaptive management recently, but like classically true adaptive management is a specific thing where you have identified clear objectives. You then, for a set period of time, run essentially like an experiment, your management, assess whether you are meeting your objectives, and if not, you iterate and adjust adaptively. That's the adapt part. So there's a lot of literature about adaptive management. There's a general consensus is that it's generally failed across the board, that we don't do it, even though it's a beautiful framework. But I would say for that system, the federal side, is there a process in which we as stakeholders in the grand scheme of things can weigh in on what those objectives should be? As of right now on the federal side, there is not an objective for things like subsistence. It's not even there. It's not in the acts, right? And so can we weigh in on these are the objectives that we as stewards, stakeholders of the resource would like to see, and direct the management in that way? That's what I would love to see more of. I think there's lots of voices of what people want, but it's maybe not being incorporated as much as it should.
Questions? Go ahead, if you can speak loud.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to go back.
Another quick comment, again, on adaptive management. I really appreciate the great research that Dr. has done on the tremendous input on increasing pink salmon throughout the state of Alaska, the amount of resources that were put into hatcheries during the 80s, early 90s. My comment and note was last year, I don't know who put the paper out, but said currently pink salmon are having a negative effect on king salmon because of the same type of fish they're eating out there. My question is, can we maybe shift the resources from increasing pink salmon to maybe looking at hatchery methods or ideas to increase king salmon along those lines? There's not one solution, but this may be another thought. Maybe District Gainer can answer that question.
So the question was,
the question is,
Chinook salmon hatcheries.
We put all these resources into increasing commercially, and that one graph the doctor had up there, all that gray, a tremendous amount of fishery, pink salmon fishery has been increased since the early 1990s because of all the hatchery input. My question is, can we decrease the pink hatchery and maybe take those same hatcheries and increase
King hatchery be a solution.
king salmon and chum salmon?
Usually hatchery produced fish aren't as robust. They're not as fine tuned to the natural environment as wild stocks. And so in Alaska we have a hatchery stocking policy that, for example, tries to keep so you wouldn't use like king salmon for supplementation if that was the point of your question. So we would try to, if you're going to stock kings, it would have to be in a system that didn't have a wild population of kings. And there are some cases that are grandfathered in, but that would be consistent with the policy. I don't know if that answered the question.
My question is, literally, pink salmon are one of the factors that's having an impact on the survival of king salmon. And so my question is, and since the state policy in the late 70s, early 80s was to increase dramatically the pink salmon, which that one graph shows, the doctor pointed out how significantly they have increased during this era. This is another era that I think maybe we might want to put less resources in increasing pink salmon and looking at the resources to increase the chum and king salmon. That's the question. Can we do that from a policy standpoint?
Yes.
I would say no, but Peter, do you have?
I mean, setting aside all the constraints and challenges, in theory, if we collectively, aquaculture associations, hatchery producers, decided that we're going to invest less in pink salmon production and put our stock in other things, conceivably it would be possible.
I thought the question was for the state.
For the state?
Yeah.
Oh, for the state to do it?
Yeah.
No, this is really, I mean, it's outside let's set aside some of the hatchery genetic policy. I mean, in general, if there was a decision to try to reduce pink salmon production, increase others, would it theoretically be possible? I mean, the answer is yeah, you could grow a lot more Chinook salmon. The question is, would it work? Would it give you the result that you wanted? And I would just, without going down a very long conversation, I would say that, again, that the evidence from elsewhere is pretty clear that, salmon aren't saved by having hatchery salmon. So if hatcheries were the solution to having few salmon in our rivers, we wouldn't have these problems. There's a lot of hatchery fish in places like the Columbia River and other places, and it doesn't solve the problems.
They've not rehabilitated wild stocks.
They have not rehabilitated wild stocks. It does not increase wild stocks. If anything, it comes at the cost of wild fish production. So it has its challenges. I think the more nuanced question might be, if we were going to reduce our pink salmon production, what are the trade-offs associated with that, right? How much benefit would you get in your Chinook salmon and other species, but how much cost would it come to the harvesters that are harvesting pink salmon? That's the more nuanced and fair questions to be asking, and I think we're headed in those directions. And just like what you were saying, Adam, at the scale of the North Pacific, there are these frameworks to be able to have some of these international conversations, because the North Pacific is essentially a shared ocean pasture. People are stocking their ocean pasture from Japan and Russia and other places, and Korea. So there are places set up, groups set up, Anadromous Pacific Fish Commission, North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission, set up to have those conversations about stocking numbers and so forth. So it could happen. Is it terribly fraught and going to be difficult? Yes. But if it was easy, we probably would have solved it already.
Go ahead.
Just going to go back to the statement about the management trade-offs, particularly in Bristol Bay with sockeye and Chinook. Is it really a conundrum with the recruitment relationships for sockeyes are getting more linear, and you're seeing some effect to Chinooks? Wouldn't you have no cost at making that trade-off?
I to me, that's a pretty, I mean, Jim, I know you, and I think that's a pretty detailed question because I'm not sure if I should answer. What's being suggested is that the stock recruit relationship for sockeye salmon in Bristol Bay, we're fishing on the very left-hand side of it, the most productive part of that stock recruit relationship. So usually think of it as something that goes up and down. And what Jim is suggesting is that in Bristol Bay, we are fishing way over here on the part that just goes up, and that we don't know very much about the part that goes down. And that the part that goes down is called compensation. And that's true. And so the suggestion was, could we fish less for sockeye, move our observed escapements rightward on the curve into a place where there might be compensation, and would that allow for Chinook recovery at the same time? That would be a tough sell, but again, the board chooses goal. The goal that's there has been chosen. And I suppose if there was enough of a voice to try something like what you're suggesting, it could be tried. But it's that situation that Jim's describing is not unique. It's very common in sockeye fisheries, especially heavily fished sockeye fisheries. I don't know if that answered your question. Tough sell. Answer your question, tough sell.
I just wanted to see you guys squirm.
It worked. Yeah, thanks, Jim. Nice to see you.
Questions?
Thank you. So my question is about sustained yield, particularly with the Board of Fish process. And I think the hard part for me, it's beautiful language in the Constitution, but whether or not it's sustainable, I think is in the eye of the beholder. Like if the number of fish returning meets a number, is that sustainable even if those fish are smaller and have less reproductive ability? And so as the public navigates the advisory committees, the Board of Fish process, what would you say are variables that we should consider in sustainability? Is it simply that the number of fish are coming back? And if so, will they come back for 10 years or 20 years? It just seems like things are changing a lot. And so for myself, orienting around what sustained yield is truly, if it's based on the past, how can we project that to the future and know that we're currently managing for sustained yield?
I'm sure these guys have thoughts about that. Your mic cut in and out, so I'm going to try to paraphrase what was said. And I think what was said, you wave me off if I'm speaking correctly, but I think what was said was that the state has a mandate to manage for sustained yield. We usually do that based on numbers of fish, and that there's currently a concern about the quality of the escapement. And if the quality of the escapement today is the same as the quality of the escapement 20 years ago, and if it's not, is the stock recruit relationship using, say, 20 years of data valid for tomorrow? Is that fair?
Much better wording, yeah.
Fair. Okay. So I would say that in my mind would be an active research question. The quality of escape, it came up in the presentation, and I would say quality of escapement is a live question right now. There are issues with implementation that are not trivial, because and to like really just cliff note it down to just brass tacks, it's tougher to manage. It comes down to in-season management, and in-season management on numbers of fish is what we know how to do. And what you're suggesting, and I didn't find it to be a bad suggestion, I don't want to imply that, but what you're suggesting is that we would manage on something we can observe, like the number of eggs or the number of females. We could try to get close to that, but it's getting a step away from the empirical thing that we can observe, and so that's kind of the challenge. But have I said enough? Are you Jones and to go? I have one more thing to say.
Or Sue.
In the stock recruit relationship that we usually estimate, there is a parameter for productivity, a parameter for compensation, and then a parameter for process error. And process error is everything that the compensatory relationship cannot explain. And so something like what you're describing, where there's a change in the reproductive capacity of the females in the population, or there's a change in the percent of females in the population, is encapsulated in that process error term. And so there's a point where the factors such as the one you mentioned have increased error to such an extent that we want to include them in the stock recruit relationship. And I would say it's a topic of active research how best to do that. But I think the spirit of your question I thought was right on, and it also, another example of this is water temperature, and there are systems in the state where the Yukon was brought up. I don't know if Sue mentioned the Deshka, but she probably is going to. So there are systems in the state where water temperature might be getting near that threshold where it's introducing so much air into our stock recruit relationship that you might consider including it in the model, so to speak. And so for someone like me, and that kind of goes back to your adaptive management question too, it's like you have to, I do statistics, so I have to prove to myself and others that we've crossed that bridge, so to speak, where we don't want to include that source of variation in kind of the general term, but we want to include it explicitly in the model. And it's an exciting thing, but it's also a difficult thing to know when and how to do. And then there's a history of it not always proving robust. You guys probably have what to say.
All right, I'm going to try to put a little bit of a positive spin, because I do think the question of it is maybe sort of philosophical about what's sustainable and for whom, and what kind of timelines we're looking at and all that stuff. But something that's over the last 20 years, when I started doing temperature work, there was very little interest in it. I got the response regularly, we're in Alaska. Really, you're going to start going on about temperature? And there was just no understanding because there was no data. And so I could just show them my data and say, this thing's kind of warm for Alaska. And since that time, things have accelerated so much in the last 20 years that nobody questions the value of having temperature data any longer. So just the fact that you're willing to say that it could be parameterized, brought out specifically, that's leaps and bounds ahead of where we were not so long ago, where people just there's no way to put temperature into my model, so sorry. And so and just all of the research that's coming out of Peter's lab and others up at UAF and UAA, there's so much more work, because my stuff is just water temperature, and I would assume that it would have some impact on salmon, but I have no data. So it's so exciting now to actually see so much research coming out about, so we begin to understand what the actual effect is of temperature at different life stages, different species. And I am certain that in 5 years, the level of sophistication in our models will only get better and better. But I think there's, you brought up a word in your presentation about hubris, and there is a point where, like, the science can only take us so far. There's a point where we have to make some value decisions about where we're going, and the science is valueless. It's not designed to be built on, like, having a direction of where you're headed. So I think you have to be careful not to just assume if we just had more data, we could solve this dilemma. And so there's a place, and again, this is sort of where I get passionate about, like, people, scientists included, have to be involved in these discussions about what our values are as Alaskans to get to where we want to go, because the data will help in some of that direction, but it's not going to point us someplace. And so we have to point what kind of science gets done and how much we just need to, we sort of already know what the answer is. Let's go there, because that's going to be a lot quicker. And maybe we'll need to correct if we've made a wrong decision, but we can also make wrong decisions with a ton of data on the table as well.
That's good.
Question is, what's the question?
Oh, I have no idea. I'm just gonna.
Yeah, we're almost like, if you guys just want to sum up everything, I think we'll call it good.
The question.
Oh, it was about
The
sustainable
question was a
yields.
good one. Is the traditional definition of sustained yield sufficient to protect our salmon populations? Right? It was a great question.
It's a great question. There's a lot to it. Escapement quality, political processes, engagement, it's all there. One thought that I had from recent time at a board meeting was not losing sight of escapement is absolutely important. Maintaining escapement, maintaining some spawners on spawning grounds is always vital. But I was seeing a lot of sort of even more importance of meeting your escapement as the goal rather than the sustained yield as the goal. So really, when it comes to having people living a way of life, food in their freezers, right? It's the yield part that really maintains a lot of those relationships, not the escapement. And so continuing to push that really we are trying to sustain yield. That's how we interact, is catching. We still need to have escapement, but I did see a bit of deferring to saying, hey, we're doing great, we're meeting our escapement, therefore we are meeting our obligation for sustained yield, even if the yield in certain systems was zero for year after year. So I would argue there's a subtlety of what people mean by the sustained yield. And so however you slice it or dice it, at the end of the day, what are we trying to sustain in this state? I would argue we are trying to sustain the relationships between salmon people in place.
That's a great place to end.
Is that a great place to end? All right. Thank you, everybody.